On the edge of a desolate ghost town, a grieving millionaire seeks nothing but solitude, until a sick child and his desperate mother appear, forcing him to confront his own heartbreak. What starts as a night of cold indifference soon becomes a journey of compassion, courage, and the unexpected chance at a new beginning. I still remember the first night I set foot in that ghost town. It is carved into my memory the way old wounds etch themselves into the body, always faintly throbbing, even when you think you've forgotten. The thing that struck me most wasn't the way the buildings leaned, half-rotten, against each other like drunks left behind after a party. It wasn't the broken glass scattered on the street or the faded paint clinging to the wood like old scars. No, what I remember most is the silence. A silence so thick, so absolute, it felt like it could bury a man alive. You think you've known silence before. Maybe in a church when everyone bows their heads at once. Maybe in a library when the only sound is the scratch of a pencil. Maybe even in the woods, miles away from any road, when the wind dies down and not even a bird stirs. But those are not silence. Those are pauses. They are the moments between breaths, between movements, between sounds. What I found in that town was not a pause. It was something deeper, older, heavier. It was as though the earth itself had stopped breathing, as though the sky had decided sound was no longer permitted to exist. I killed the engine of my car and immediately felt it, the pressure of it, pressing against my chest, filling my ears, crawling down my throat. I sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield at the shapes of buildings etched in shadow. There was no wind that night, not even a sigh through the dead grass. I remember thinking that maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe some places are abandoned for good reason. But I had come there for a reason too, and a man like me had nowhere else left to go. So I opened the door. The crunch of gravel under my boots rang out like gunfire, and I almost winced at the noise I made, as if I had broken some unspoken law of the town. My flashlight beam swept over cracked windows, warped doorframes, rusted hinges. Shadows lunged at me and shrank back with each move of my hand. Every doorway looked like a mouth waiting to swallow me, and still there was that silence. It followed me, pressed me down, whispered to me in ways I didn't understand. The truth is, I had wanted silence. I had spent too many years surrounded by noise I couldn't stand anymore. Laughter at parties that rang hollow, the chatter of people who wanted something from me, the constant hum of a world that didn't notice when a man's heart broke apart. After I lost my daughter, all that noise became unbearable. The voices of friends, of colleagues, of strangers, they meant nothing. They were knives, every word cutting deeper, reminding me of the one voice I would never hear again. I went looking for silence. I thought maybe it could heal me. Or maybe I thought it could punish me. Maybe both. But the silence I found in that ghost town wasn't a companion. It was something else. It was alive. It had weight. It sat in my lungs until I thought I might choke on it, and it listened. That was the worst of it. It listened when I whispered apologies into the night, words I had never said when it mattered. I told her I was sorry. Sorry for every moment I had wasted. Sorry for every time I should have held her closer. Sorry for leaving her alone when she needed me most. I whispered to my little girl, as if she might somehow hear me through the ruins of that place and the silence. It listened, but then it changed. I can't explain how. It was the same emptiness, the same hush, but suddenly I felt it wasn't just me anymore. It was the pause you feel when someone else is in the room, someone you haven't seen but can sense. I stopped walking and swung the flashlight beam across the street. Empty windows stared back like blind eyes. A sign above the old saloon swung once on its hinge, though no wind stirred. I told myself it was nothing. Just rot and rust, wood shifting in the night. But I've lived long enough to know when something isn't right. And that night, in that place, something was wrong. I thought of all the nights I had tried to sleep in my own house. After the funeral, when the air felt too thick to breathe and every shadow seemed to lean in closer. I thought of how I used to lie awake, listening for her voice, praying I would hear her laugh just once more, even if it was only in my head. And I realized I had come to that ghost town not just to escape noise, but to chase something else. To chase a haunting. Because sometimes when you've lost too much, you would rather be haunted than be alone. That night, in that silence, I felt the haunting I had been looking for. At first, it was only a shuffle. A faint scrape, like a foot dragging across gravel. My flashlight snapped toward the sound, and my heart slammed in my chest. The beam caught nothing but an alleyway filled with broken crates and shadows. I told myself it was an animal. A coyote. A rat, something ordinary. But then I heard it again. Not a shuffle this time, a pattern. A rhythm. A deliberate weight of feet pressing down, lifting up, pressing down again. Footsteps. My mouth went dry. My knuckles ached from gripping the flashlight too tightly. I wanted to call out to demand who was there, but the words stuck in my throat. Some part of me, the oldest part, knew the truth. No one was supposed to be there. That town was dead. Its bones had been picked clean by time. Yet the footsteps lived. The silence closed in tighter, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I stood frozen, waiting, listening, each second stretching out like a lifetime. And then it came, a sound so small, so fragile. It cut through the silence sharper than any scream. A cough. Not the cough of a man clearing his throat, not the rasp of age. A child's cough. High, brittle, unmistakable. In that moment, the world spun sideways. My body turned cold, because there was no mistaking it. That sound was alive. That sound didn't belong to the wind, or the wood, or the ruins. It belonged to someone else, someone small. Someone breathing in a place where no one should have been breathing at all. I had come to bury myself in silence. But instead, I had uncovered something buried beneath it. That night, in the heart of a town everyone swore was abandoned, I heard footsteps. And a child's cough. Who else could be living in a dead town? I wasn't always the man who went looking for silence in a dead town. There was a time when the world felt alive, as if every morning carried a promise written in sunlight. My earliest years were spent in fields my father worked with his hands. I can still feel the tickle of wheat brushing against my arms as I ran through those endless rows, the earth soft beneath my bare feet. My father's laughter would follow me, low and booming, the kind of sound that filled you with safety. When he called my name, it carried across the whole field, strong enough to draw me back, no matter how far I had wandered. And then there was my mother. She had a gift for turning even the smallest tasks into music. She sang when she cooked. She sang when she mended clothes. She sang when she tucked me in at night. Sometimes it was songs she'd learned from her own mother. Sometimes it was melodies she invented on the spot. It didn't matter. Her voice softened the edges of everything, as if she could smooth the world just by humming. Those songs stayed with me long after I grew older, long after she was gone. Back then, I thought life was permanent. A boy doesn't question the sunrise. He doesn't imagine that the voices he loves could ever fall silent. Childhood is a kind of blindness. We think happiness is carved in stone, unbreakable. We never realize how fragile it all is until it shatters. I left those fields when I became a man, chasing opportunity, chasing wealth, chasing some idea of success I thought would make me whole. And for a time, I believed it did. The city gave me everything. Tall buildings, crowded rooms, hands shaking mine with respect. But the truth is, even then, even when I wore expensive suits and sat at polished tables, I carried the farm inside me. The memory of my father's steady voice, the sound of my mother's songs, they were like roots tangled around my heart, reminders of where I began. And then she came. My daughter. The moment she entered my life, the world changed again. I thought I had known love before, in small ways, but nothing prepared me for the storm she brought into my heart. I remember the weight of her in my arms the first time I held her. She was so impossibly small, her entire hand no larger than my thumb. Yet the grip of her fingers felt stronger than anything I had ever known. When she cried, I thought my chest would burst open with the need to protect her. When she looked at me with eyes still foggy from birth, I felt seen in a way I never had before. Her laughter became my compass. She had this bubbling laugh that seemed to rise straight out of her belly, a laugh that could turn the darkest day into morning. I'd find myself doing foolish things just to hear it again, faces, voices, games that made no sense. It didn't matter. When she laughed, the world was new. She grew fast as children do. I remember her running in the park, her hair flying behind her like a banner, her legs pumping so fast I thought she might lift off the ground. She'd come running back into my arms, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. And in those moments, I believed the universe had forgiven me for all my mistakes. She was my redemption. At night, when the world was quiet, she would curl against me on the couch, her head heavy on my chest, her breath warm and steady. I would sit as still as possible, afraid to disturb the peace of her sleep. In those moments, nothing else mattered, not the deals I was chasing, not the responsibilities waiting outside our door, not the shadows of my past. She was my whole world, contained in that small body, that small beating heart. Sometimes she would sing too. Not like my mother, her little songs weren't in tune, and half the time she forgot the words, but they were hers. And when I listened, I thought maybe my mother was right there in the room with us, smiling at how the music had found its way into another generation. And then, as it always does, life reminded me how cruel it can be. It began with a cough. Just a cough. I told myself it was nothing. Children get sick. They bounce back, but the cough lingered. It deepened. Then came the fevers, the nights of worry, the endless visits to doctors whose faces grew heavier with each appointment. I clung to hope the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, convincing myself that medicine, money, sheer willpower could fix it, but none of it could. I held her hand the night she slipped away. I felt the warmth leave her fingers as if it were leaving me too. I kissed her forehead, whispered promises she could no longer hear, begged a God I wasn't even sure I believed in. And then there was silence. A silence so final, so absolute. It made the silence of that ghost town years later seem like a whisper. Do you know what it is to walk back into your house after burying your child? It's a different kind of emptiness. Her toys were still there. Her shoes by the door. Her drawings taped to the refrigerator. The house looked alive, but it wasn't. It was a mausoleum where every object mocked me with what I had lost. I tried to carry on. I wore the mask of a man who still belonged in the world. I sat in meetings, nodded at words I didn't hear, smiled at faces that blurred together. But inside, I was gone. Each laugh I heard from others was a knife twisting deeper, reminding me of the laugh I would never hear again. Each time someone spoke of the future, I wanted to scream, because mine had ended the night hers did. I became a hollow man, drifting through days without meaning. Friends told me to keep busy. Time will heal, they said. But time doesn't heal. Time only teaches you how to live with the wound. And mine was a wound I didn't want to heal. It was all I had left of her. So I left everything behind. The city, the work, the people who tried to help but only made the hole deeper. I walked away from it all, carrying nothing but my grief and the ghost of her laughter. I thought if I could find a place empty enough, forgotten enough, I could disappear inside it. That was when I found the town. People thought I was mad. Why would a man with money waste it on a place that had died decades ago? Why would anyone want to own a ruin? But to me, the question was never why. It was how could I not? That town was me, abandoned, broken, stripped of life. Its silence called to mine. I told myself I was punishing myself. That by burying myself in a place stripped of everything, I could atone for failing her. That maybe, if I lived among ruins, my own ruin would make sense. But another voice whispered that I was running, that I was escaping the reminders, the faces, the voices, the unbearable weight of living among the living, and the truth. I don't know which it was, punishment or escape, maybe both. Maybe I thought if I locked myself away in silence, fate would finally let me rest. But fate wasn't done with me. I thought I buried my heart with her. I thought love had left me forever. But in that ghost town, I would learn that grief does not always end in emptiness. Sometimes it opens a door you never expected. And so the question lingers, why did I buy the ghost town? To punish myself or to escape? They say you can't buy peace. Maybe they're right. All I know is I tried. $10. That's all it cost me to buy an entire town. The lawyers thought I was joking when I signed the papers. They passed the deed across the desk like it was a prank, some forgotten file left to gather dust. $10 for a cluster of broken houses, a church with a roof caved in, and streets no one had walked in decades. They laughed under their breath when I shook their hands, but I didn't care. Let them laugh. They didn't know what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for a town. I was looking for silence. For exile. For a grave large enough to bury myself in while I was still alive. The day the deed became mine, I felt a strange satisfaction settle over me. I had finally found the one place no one else wanted. A place as ruined as I was. When I drove there the first time as its owner, dusk was bleeding into night. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds stretched thin like bruises across the horizon. The wind had picked up, threading itself through the buildings, and the sound it made was eerie like a flute played by hands long dead. Every doorway gaped open. Every window was an empty eye socket staring into nothing. Fences leaned, broken, and weeds grew through cracks in the street. The place smelled of dust and rust and rain long gone. I parked the car at what had once been the town's main square. The sign that used to welcome visitors had fallen. Its letters faded until they were unreadable. The silence wrapped around me again, thick and suffocating. The kind of silence that makes your heart beat too loudly in your own ears. This, I thought. This is what I came for. I unpacked the few belongings I'd brought, a bedroll, a lantern, a bottle of whiskey I wasn't sure I'd even open. I chose an old store as my shelter. Its shelves had long been stripped bare, its counters covered in dust. I set the lantern down, lit it, and watched the shadows stretch against the walls. Outside, the wind moaned through the alleyways, rattling shutters and shifting debris across the ground. It should have felt empty, but instead it felt watchful, as though the town was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. That first night I wandered through the streets with the lantern, exploring what I had purchased. Each step stirred echoes. My light passed over faded signs. Barber shop, mercantile, rail depot. The train station roof had caved in, the platform rotting beneath my boots. At the edge of town, the church leaned against the sky. Its steeple cracked like a broken finger pointing nowhere. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, thinking about funerals, about prayers, about the grave I had stood beside years ago. I thought maybe I could kneel there and speak to her. But the words never came. Instead, I walked back to the square, sat on the steps of the store, and let the silence swallow me whole. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks again. A shuffle, a faint scrape across the ground. My hand tightened on the lantern. I turned, sweeping the light across the street. For a moment, nothing. Just the hollow faces of buildings. Staring back. Then movement, quick, small, vanishing around the corner. I froze. My breath caught. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a stray dog or a coyote sniffing through the ruins. But some part of me, deep down, knew better. Because I could still hear it, the sound of feet. Not paws. Feet. I rose slowly, lantern in one hand, the other instinctively curling into a fist. I followed the sound, each step crunching against gravel. My heart thudded in my chest like it hadn't in years. When I turned the corner, the light fell on them, a woman. Thin, weary, her clothes worn from too many days of use. She froze in the lantern's glow, her arms tightening protectively around the small figure beside her. A boy, pale-faced, no more. Then 8 or 9, his eyes wide and frightened in the sudden light. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The silence between us was louder than any shout. "What the hell are you doing here?" The words tore out of me before I could think. My voice sounded harsh, ragged, like it hadn't been used in years. The woman didn't answer. She only pulled the boy closer, her hand brushing his hair back. From his forehead. He coughed then, a dry, hollow cough that echoed in the empty street. I felt something twist in my chest. Anger surged through me, hot and immediate. This was supposed to be my exile, my silence, my grave. And here they were. 2 strangers in the one place I thought no one could reach. "You don't belong here," I snapped. "This town is mine. You need to leave, now." Still, she said nothing. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but they didn't waver either. She only looked down at the boy, whose small body shook with another cough. He tried to straighten, tried to be strong, but his legs buckled beneath him. Before I could stop myself, I stepped forward, catching him before he hit the ground. His weight was feather-light, terrifyingly so. I could feel the heat of fever through his thin shirt, could hear the rattle in his chest as he tried to breathe. My lantern trembled in my hand. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, lowering him gently to the ground. His eyes fluttered, half-lidded, and the sound he made, the desperate rasp of a child trying to pull air into his lungs, was a sound I knew too well. For a heartbeat, I wasn't in that ghost town anymore. I was back in a hospital room, holding a smaller hand, listening to the same cough, the same struggle. My vision blurred, my throat tightened. I wanted to push the memory away, to bury it like I had tried to bury everything else, but it rose. Up anyway, cruel and unrelenting. The woman dropped to her knees beside him, her face pale with worry. "Please," she whispered, finally speaking. Her voice was soft, frayed at the edges, but strong in its desperation. "He's sick." I swallowed. Hard, torn between fury and something I didn't want to name. I had come here to escape humanity, to escape reminders of love and loss. Yet here it was, dropped at my feet in the form of a coughing child and a mother's plea. I looked down at the boy again, his body shuddering with each breath. And the sound he made, God help me, it was the same sound my little girl had made when she fought to stay alive. That same fragile, rattling cough, that same desperate reach for air. My chest ached. My hands shook. I felt the silence of the town closing in again, wrapping around us, binding me to this moment whether I wanted it or not. And before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. Barely a whisper, almost to myself. God help me. He sounds like her. The days that followed were not easy. The moment I found Clara and Ethan, everything I had come to the ghost town to escape was dragged back into the light. I should have sent them away. I told myself that again and again. But the boy's cough lingered in my ears, echoing like a ghost that refused to leave. I couldn't shake it. Every time he gasped for breath, it was as though my daughter was there again, reaching for me, begging me not to let go. I tried to keep my distance. I told Clara I didn't want them there, that the town was mine now, that they were trespassers. She stared at me with eyes that held no apology, only defiance, and for a moment I almost admired her nerve. But beneath that steel, I saw something else to fear. She was like an animal cornered, bristling not because she wanted to fight, but because she had nowhere left to run, The boy was too weak to leave. His illness clung to him like a shadow. Clara tended to him as best she could, but I could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled when she cooled his forehead with damp cloths. Sometimes when the fever climbed too high, Ethan would moan in his sleep, and that sound tore through me like a blade. I told myself I had no obligation, but I still found myself fetching water, building fires, cutting wood to keep them warm. Every act of help felt like betrayal of the exile I had chosen. Betrayal of the silence I thought I wanted. Clara noticed. She didn't thank me, not at first. Gratitude, I think, would have felt like surrender to her. Instead, she watched me with suspicion, as though waiting for me to turn them out at any moment. I didn't blame her. She had the look of someone who had learned never to trust too easily. We spoke little those first days. When we did, it was sharp, clipped, like two blades sparking against each other. And yet, the more I tried to push them away, the more the boy drew me back in. Ethan had her eyes, my daughter's, not the same color, not the same shape, but something in the way they looked at the world. Innocent, but tired. As though even at his young age, he already knew how fragile everything was. Sometimes when he smiled weakly through the coughs, I would feel a warmth I thought I had buried forever. And then guilt would crash over me like a wave. Because how could I let another child near my heart when I had already failed one? The flashbacks came often. I'd be carrying water for Clara, and suddenly I'd remember carrying my little girl on my shoulders, her laughter ringing in my ears. I'd hear Ethan coughing in the night, and suddenly I was back in that hospital room, clutching a small hand as life slipped away. Each memory was both a gift and a curse. It kept her alive in me, but it also opened the wound wider. Clara began to speak more as the days wore on. She told me fragments of her story, never all at once, but enough for me to piece together the shape of her suffering. Her husband had died, leaving her with little but grief and a child to care for. His family, her in-laws, saw her not as kin, but as an obstacle. There was land, money, property that should have passed to Ethan one day, but they wanted it for themselves. She described them as wolves in human skin, smiling to her face while sharpening their teeth behind closed doors. They threatened her, manipulated her, made it clear she had no place in their home. So she ran. She took her boy and disappeared, slipping between places until she found her way to the ghost town. She thought no one would look for her here. Her words stirred something I didn't want to admit. Because hadn't I done the same, run from the world? Hidden in the ruins of silence, hoping to be forgotten. Clara and I were different in many ways, but in this we were the same, two broken people trying to disappear. Still, I clung to my hardness. I told myself her troubles weren't mine. I told her to leave as soon as Ethan was well enough to walk. She looked at me then, and for the first time I saw not fear, not suspicion, but anger. "Where would you have us go?" she demanded. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of desperation. "There is nowhere left." Her words struck deeper than I wanted them to, because I understood. I too had felt the world shrink until there was no place left to stand, but I refused to soften. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I repeated it like a prayer every night. Yet each morning I found myself cutting more wood, fetching more water, even sitting by Ethan's side when the coughing fits grew too violent for Clara to bear alone. I hated myself for it. Hated the part of me that still cared, that still reached out even when I swore I wouldn't. It was during one of those nights when the boy's fever burned hottest that Clara told me the truth I hadn't wanted to hear. She sat across the fire from me, her face hollow with worry, and whispered, "They'll come for us." I didn't answer. I didn't want to know more. But she kept speaking, her voice low, as if the night itself might be listening. "His family. They don't care about him. They care about what he stands in the way of. If they find us, they'll take everything. And they won't hesitate to hurt us to do it." I stared into the flames, feeling the old war inside me rage again. One voice told me to turn away, to let her fight her own battles, to keep my heart locked in the coffin I had built for it. The other voice, quieter but stronger, whispered of duty, of compassion, of the daughter I had lost and the boy who still had a chance. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the dark. Clara's eyes reflected them like shards of glass. "You don't understand," she said softly. "They will come. And when they do, there will be no mercy." Her words lingered. Long after she fell silent, I sat there listening to the boy's labored breathing, feeling my own heart pound with a question I couldn't escape. Would I stay cold, as I had sworn I would? Or would I let myself get pulled into their struggle? I didn't have an answer then, but the night gave me one anyway. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a sound carried through the ruins of the town, distant, but unmistakable. Engines, more than one. The growl of vehicles approaching down the dirt road. Clara's head snapped up. Her face went pale, her lips trembling as she whispered the words I already knew in my gut. "They found us." And in that moment, every wall I had built inside me began to crack. The night after Clara's warning, I couldn't sleep. Not because of Ethan's coughing that had become almost a rhythm, a grim kind of heartbeat that filled the silence, but because the air in the town itself seemed heavier, as though it was carrying secrets I had not yet been told. Every gust of wind rattled the buildings, every creak of timber sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But even as the fire burned low, I found my eyes strained to the shadows, half expecting them to move. The town had always felt empty, but now it felt watchful. I began walking the streets at night, lantern in one hand, the other resting uneasily against my side. The buildings seemed to lean closer than they had before. Doors that I swore I had shut hung half open when I returned. Windows that were boarded looked as though the boards had been pried loose. It could have been the wind, it could have been rot. But each time I told myself that, another doubt stirred. One evening, I pushed open the door of an old boarding house near the edge of town. The hinges groaned like a dying man, and the air inside was thick with dust. I swept the beam of the lantern across broken tables, collapsed chairs, and wallpaper curling away from the walls like parchment. In the back room, I found a trunk, half buried under debris. Curiosity got the better of me. I pried it open, and inside were journals. Dozens of them, their leather covers cracked, their pages yellowed. I should have left them there. But something in me, a hunger, maybe, or a sickness, needed to know. I sat down in the dim light and began to read. The journals belonged to townsfolk from long ago. At first, they spoke of ordinary things, harvests, families, Sunday sermons. But the deeper I read, the darker it grew. There were stories of betrayal, neighbors turning on neighbors, fortunes hoarded and stolen, promises broken in the name of survival. The town hadn't died because the mines ran dry. It had rotted from within. Greed had poisoned it. The people had consumed each other until there was nothing left. I felt a chill run through me as I closed the last journal. Betrayal, greed, broken promises. Wasn't that the story of my own life? I had chased wealth, chased success, until I lost the only thing that mattered. I had betrayed my daughter, not with malice, but with neglect. I had been blind to what was slipping away. And now, sitting there in the ruins, I felt as though the town was holding a mirror up to my soul, showing me that I belonged among its ghosts because I was no better than them. After that, I began noticing symbols carved into the wood of some buildings. Strange, jagged markings, circles, crosses, lines intersecting at odd angles. At first, I thought they were the work of children or vandals long ago. But the more I looked, the more deliberate they seemed. Warnings, perhaps, or curses. And always, they seemed to cluster around the places where the journals spoke of betrayals. It was as if the town itself had tried to mark its own sins, too. brand its history onto its bones. Clara asked me once why I kept wandering. I didn't tell her the truth. I said I was checking the town for weaknesses, making sure no one could sneak in without us knowing. But the truth was darker. I was looking for answers. Answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Then came the men. First, I thought the flicker of movement at the edge of town was my imagination. Shadows darting between buildings, vanishing when I turned. But the next night, I heard boots crunching softly on gravel, too careful to be chance. I found cigarette butts still warm near the old rail depot. Once, as I passed by the church, I caught the glint of eyes watching me from the belfry, only to vanish when I raised the lantern. Clara noticed too. She grew more tense, more protective, pulling Ethan closer to her whenever the wind shifted strangely. "They found us," she whispered one evening as we sat by the fire. "They're waiting." I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to believe the shadows were only in my mind, that the town was not filling with predators sent by her in-laws. But the truth was, I didn't know anymore. The silence had become unreliable. My own thoughts had become unreliable. Some nights I would wake to the sound of doors slamming, only to find them closed tight when I checked. Once, I swore I heard my daughter's voice calling me from the alleyway. I stumbled out into the dark, heart hammering, only to find nothing. But the wind stirring dust around my boots. Was the town haunted? Or was it just me, my grief, my guilt casting shadows where none existed? I don't know. Even now, as an old man, I still don't. But I do know this. Something was coming. The town was waiting. The silence was sharpening. Clara's in-laws would not stop until they had what they wanted. And the shadows I saw at night were only the beginning. There are moments in a man's life when he knows the past is done with excuses. When he knows there's no more running, no more hiding, no more silence. That moment came for me one night as I sat alone in the store, the fire guttering low. I heard Ethan cough in his sleep, Clara murmuring soft words to calm him. I thought of the journals, of the greed that killed this town. I thought of the men who hunted Clara and her boy, and of the girl I had already lost. My hands trembled as I reached under the counter and pulled out the rifle I hadn't touched in years. The wood was dry, the metal cold, but the weight of it felt familiar, almost inevitable. I sat there staring at it for a long time, listening to the silence pressing against the walls, until I whispered to myself words I had not spoken in decades. That night, I loaded my rifle. For the first time in years. They came at dawn. I knew they would. The night before had been too quiet, the silence too heavy, the shadows too still. When the sun rose over the hills, I saw the dust first thin trails on the horizon, twisting into the sky. Then the growl of engines reached my ears, low and steady, like wolves circling their prey. Clara saw them too. She clutched Ethan close, her face pale, her eyes dark with fear. "It's them," she whispered. She didn't need to say who, I already knew. Her in-laws. The wolves that had driven her into hiding. The trucks rolled into the square, tires grinding gravel. Men spilled out hard-eyed, rough-handed, carrying the kind of arrogance that comes from believing the law will never touch you. Their leader stepped forward, a tall man with a face carved from stone and a voice that carried across the empty town. "Clara," he called, smiling without warmth. "This charade ends today. You come with us, and the boy too. You know what's owed." Clara's grip on Ethan tightened. She didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. I should have stayed in the shadows. I should have let her fight her own battle. That's what the old me would have done, the man who chose exile, who believed he had no heart left to give. But that morning, I stepped forward, not as a millionaire. Not as a man who had once owned half the city. I stepped forward as a father who had once failed his child, and who could not bear to fail another. "She's not going anywhere," I said. My voice was rough, but it carried. The men turned, surprised to see me there. A ghost stepping out. Of the ruins, the leader's smile faded. "And who the hell are you?" I felt the rifle heavy in my hands. I hadn't held one in years, but the weight of it seemed natural now. "The man who owns this town," I said. "And the man who's telling you to leave it." They laughed. A chorus of harsh, mocking sound that bounced off the buildings. But beneath it, I could see the unease in their eyes. They hadn't expected resistance. "Certainly not from me." The leader stepped closer, his boots grinding against the gravel. "Old man, you're making a mistake. This doesn't concern you. Step aside, and you won't get hurt." I thought of my daughter then, of her small hand in mine, growing weaker with each passing day, of how I had stood aside once before, helpless, useless, watching life slip away because I hadn't fought hard enough. "Not this time." I raised the rifle. "It concerns me now." For a moment, the square was still. The wind held its breath. Then everything broke at once. One of the men lunged forward. I fired. The shot cracked through the silence like thunder, the recoil jolting my shoulder. The man stumbled back, cursing, his arm torn open. Chaos erupted. The others shouted, scattering, raising their own weapons. Bullets screamed past me, chipping stone, shattering glass. I moved without thinking, without caring if I lived or died. I fought with desperation, with the fury of a man who had already lost everything once. I fired again and again, ducking behind walls, my lungs burning, my body aching. Every step was agony, but I kept moving. Because behind me in the old store, Clara and Ethan were waiting. Depending on me. The men pressed closer. One rushed me with a knife, his face twisted with rage. I swung the rifle like a club, the wood cracking against his jaw, sending him sprawling. Another came from the side, and I felt the searing pain of a fist across my ribs. I staggered, fell to one knee, the world spinning. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought death had finally come to claim me, but then I heard it, Ethan's voice, weak but clear. "Grandpa." The word cut through everything. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't just fear. It was trust. Pure, unshaken trust. The kind my daughter had once had for me before I failed her. And in that instant, something inside me broke open. The shell I had built around my heart shattered. I rose with a strength I didn't know I had left. Pain screamed through my body, but I didn't care. I swung the rifle, drove the men back, fired until the chamber clicked empty. I shouted, not words but a raw cry that rose from years of grief, rage, and love long buried. The sound startled them more than the bullets had, and then slowly they began to retreat. The leader glared at me, hatred burning in his eyes, but he saw the truth too. I wasn't just an old man. I was a father fighting for a child. And that makes a man dangerous, no matter his age. They backed away, cursing, spitting promises of return. The trucks roared to life, engines growling as they turned back down the road. Dust swallowed them, and silence fell once more. I stood there trembling, the rifle heavy in my hands, my chest heaving with ragged breaths. Blood ran warm down my side where a bullet had grazed me, and every bone in my body screamed with exhaustion. I thought I might collapse. But then I felt small arms wrap around me. Ethan, his face pressed against my chest, his voice muffled but certain. "Grandpa." The word broke me. Not with pain, but with something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Redemption. Clara's eyes met mine over the boy's shoulder. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. In her gaze, I saw gratitude and something deeper, recognition. That in protecting them, I had protected myself. I looked out over the empty square, the broken buildings, the silence that once felt like a grave. And I wondered if, in that moment, I had finally found what I had been searching for all along. Not exile, not punishment, but a chance to be whole again. Still, the question lingered. even as Ethan clung to me and Clara watched in silence. Had I found redemption through them? Or was I only beginning to understand what redemption meant? The truth, perhaps, is that I'll never know. I used to believe silence was the only inheritance left for me. That I had run the course of my life and found nothing at the end but dust. When I paid $10 for a town everyone else had abandoned, I thought I was buying solitude, punishment, and a grave wide enough to lie down in while still breathing. I didn't know I was buying the ground for something new, but the town has changed. Or perhaps I have. The silence that once pressed on my chest like a stone has loosened. In its place are the sounds of life, subtle at first, but steady, growing stronger each day. The scrape of a hoe across soil. The clatter of dishes washed in cold water. Clara's soft humming, not quite a song, but something close. Ethan's laughter, ringing bright and unashamed as he runs down the dusty streets. These sounds don't erase the silence. They reshape it, weaving through it until the town breathes again. It began in the garden. Clara planted it in a patch of earth behind the store, coaxing life from soil that looked too dry to hold anything. At first, I doubted it. Everything here seemed broken beyond repair. But she tended it with patience, and one morning, green shoots poked through the dirt. She smiled then, and the smile itself was enough to change the square. Where there had only been ruins, now there was the promise of food, of continuity, of a future. Ethan was the next to bring change. His illness had once gripped him like chains, but slowly, as weeks passed, he grew stronger. His cough eased, his legs steadied. Soon, he was running again, rolling an old wagon wheel down the street, chasing it with shouts of joy. His laughter bounced against walls that had been mute for decades. The sound startled me at first. I had grown so used to emptiness, but then it soothed me, as though the town itself had been waiting for that kind of sound. I found myself working too. At first, I resented it. I had come here to rot, not to build. But when I picked up tools long abandoned, something in me remembered. My hands grew calloused again. I patched a roof, mended a shutter, raised a wall. Sweat streaked my face, my back ached, but I found satisfaction in the ache. It reminded me of the days in my father's fields, when work had been honest and nights had ended in tired peace. The seasons began to leave their mark. Spring brought a stubborn green back into the cracks of the town. Summer baked us hard, but it also filled the gardens Clara had planted, the beans curling up their poles like they knew where they belonged. In autumn, the air cooled, and we harvested together, placing potatoes into baskets as Ethan cheered at the size of them. Winter was harsh. The winds howled through the empty streets, and the cold sank into our bones, but we huddled near them. Fire, telling stories and surviving together. And with each season's turn, the town shed a little more of its death, and I shed a little more of my despair. It was Ethan who truly broke through the walls I had built. He followed me everywhere, peppering me with questions. Why does wood crack when it dries? How do you tell if rain is coming? Can you really make fire with stones? His curiosity reminded me of my daughter's endless questions. The way she once clung to every word as though the world itself was something to be discovered. Each time he asked, I answered, and each answer was like a stitch pulling me back into life. The moment he called me Grandpa nearly brought me to my knees. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows, and I was chopping wood. Sweat stung my eyes. He came running up, handed me a canteen, and set it as casually as though he'd said it 100 times before. Here, Grandpa. The axe slipped from my hands. My throat tightened. That single word cracked the coffin I had sealed around my heart. For years, I thought I would never hear a child's voice call me by a name of love again. And yet, here, it was spoken with trust and belonging. I said nothing then. I only reached out and ruffled his hair, my voice rough as I muttered thanks. But inside, something broke and something healed all at once. I knew then that though my daughter was gone, I had been given another chance, not to replace her, never that, but to honor her by protecting this boy who had stumbled into my life. Clara, too, changed. At first she was wary, her eyes always measuring me, as if waiting for the moment I would cast her and Ethan out. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, her suspicion softened. She began to trust, to speak more openly. She told me stories of her husband, of the kindness he once showed her, of the grief she carried when he died. She spoke of her in-laws, their cruelty and greed, the way they treated her and Ethan like obstacles instead of family. She had been hunted, driven, left with nowhere to go. And in her telling, I saw her not as a burden but as a survivor, stronger than most men I had known. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the town in gold, Clara looked around and said quietly, "It doesn't feel like a ghost anymore." Ethan grinned at that, his hands still dirty from helping in the garden. "It's New Haven," he declared. The words rang clear, and something in them stuck. A haven, a place of safety, a new beginning. I carved the name into wood myself, my hand steady as I etched the letters. When I nailed the sign above the square, it felt like more than a name. It felt like a promise that, of course, life is never without hardship. The in-laws returned once, trying to intimidate us, but we stood together, and they left with nothing but dust in their mouths. Illness visited again, striking Clara with fever, but she recovered with care. Storms tore down the fences, and we built them again. Each challenge reminded me that survival is not about avoiding hardship, it's about meeting it together. Now when I walk through New Haven, I no longer see ruins. I see Clara hanging laundry in the breeze, Ethan chasing chickens he insisted we keep, green vines curling along fences we rebuilt. I hear the sound of hammers and laughter, not wind, rattling through emptiness. The silence that once buried me is gone. In its place is life. I often think of the price I paid, $10. $10 for a town of bones and shadows. It was the cheapest purchase I ever made, and yet it has given me more than all the fortunes I once held. Wealth filled my pockets once, but it never filled my soul. Here, in this broken, mended place, I found something wealth could not buy. Family. Do not misunderstand me. The grief of losing my daughter has not vanished. It never will. There are nights when I wake and still reach for her voice, when I sit by the fire and see her smile in the flames. That pain is part of me, and I carry it as I always will. But now, alongside the grief, there is something else. A reason to rise each morning. A reason to keep breathing. I may not have many years left. My body is slower, my strength less than it once was. But I no longer fear the end. Because when it comes, I will not die as a ghost. I will die as a man who built something, who protected. Someone who allowed himself to love again. A man can lose his fortune, his pride, even his child. I know this too well. But if he still has kindness, he is never truly bankrupt. That is what I have learned in New Haven. That is what I will leave behind. And so I turn the question to you, listening now to an old man's tale. What would you do if ghosts came knocking? Not the kind that haunt graveyards, but the ones that rise from your own heart, the memories, the regrets, the second chances you never expected. Would you turn them away, let silence consume you? Or would you open the door, let them in, and allow them to change you? I opened the door, and it saved me. I used to think I bought silence for $10. That was the price of my grave. A grave not dug in the earth, but stretched across streets of dust, buildings falling into themselves, windows that stared at nothing. I thought I'd bury myself here in solitude, swallowed by silence so thick it could choke the last breath out of me, but I was wrong. The town didn't stay dead. It stirred. Slowly at first, almost reluctantly, as though testing whether it was allowed to live again. It began with Clara's hands in the dirt, pressing seeds into soil that looked too dry to hold anything. It began with Ethan's cough, fragile but stubborn, refusing to fade into the silence I thought I wanted. It began with the sound of laughter echoing down a street where no laughter had been heard in 50 years. New Haven, we call it now. And each day I watch it grow, I realize that I hadn't bought a grave at all. I had bought a beginning. The first garden was small, barely a patch behind the store. I remember standing there as Clara worked, the sun sharp on her shoulders, her brow wet with sweat. She pressed her palms into the soil with a quiet reverence, as though she were laying something to rest. But what sprouted weeks later wasn't death. It was green, alive, pushing upward. The first time Ethan plucked a bean pod and held it up like treasure, his grin nearly split his face. That garden became a promise. Not just food, but proof that life could return where we thought it was impossible. That same week, I found myself repairing the roof over the store, hammer in hand, muttering curses at nails that bent too easily. My arms ached, my back protested, but when the rain came and Clara's roof didn't leak, I felt something I hadn't in years. Pride, maybe, or belonging. And then Ethan's laughter began to echo across the square. At first it startled me. I had grown used to silence, to the heavy kind that pressed against your chest. But his laughter cut through it like sunlight through fog. He found an old wagon wheel, rolled it down the street, chasing it with whoops and shouts. His cough still followed him sometimes, but it was lighter now, less like a chain and more like a memory. Each laugh was a declaration. The boy was alive, and the town would be too. I found myself teaching him simple things at first: how to tie knots, how to spot a storm brewing from the color of the sky, how to set a fire that would last the night. He followed me like a shadow, always asking questions, always listening. His voice was insistent, curious. Why does wood crack? How do you know which plants you can eat? Can you show me again, Grandpa? The first time he called me that, Grandpa, I nearly dropped the axe in my hand. It was so natural, so unthinking, as though he had always known me that way. The word hit me harder than any blow I took in my life. My daughter's voice rose up inside me, her laughter, her tiny hand clutching mine, the way she once whispered, "Daddy," before she drifted to sleep. That one word from Ethan cracked the coffin around my heart, split it wide open. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him I wasn't his grandfather. I only reached out, ruffled his hair, and let the words sink into me like rain into dry ground. For years, I thought I'd buried my heart with my daughter. That love was a door forever shut. But Ethan, in his innocence, in his fragile persistence, opened it again. Clara, too, changed with time. At first, her eyes were sharp, watchful, as though every kindness I showed was a trap waiting to snap shut. But days became weeks, and weeks turned to months, and suspicion gave way to trust. She began to share more. Sometimes it was small recipes her mother once taught her, stories of Ethan's first words, the way her husband used to laugh. Other times, it was darker. She told me about her in-laws, how they circled her like vultures, how they threatened her with smiles, how they wanted her gone so they could take everything Ethan was meant to inherit. I listened, because I knew the sound of being hunted. Grief had hunted me. Guilt had stalked me for years. Her predators wore human faces. Mine wore memory. But in that firelight, we were the same. Two souls who had run from wolves and found shelter in each other. We began to call the town something other than dead. One evening, as we stood in the square, Clara looked at the setting sun painting gold across the broken buildings. "It doesn't feel like a ghost anymore," she said softly. And Ethan, dirty from playing in the dirt, shouted, "New Haven." His voice echoed, bold and certain. New Haven. That was the name we carried forward, carved into a plank of wood. I nailed above the square myself. A name that was less about where we were and more about what we had become. The seasons rolled over us like waves. Spring brought green into cracks we thought permanent. Summer scorched us, but the gardens grew thick, stubborn. Autumn cooled, and we harvested together, baskets heavy with potatoes and beans. Winter came fierce, with winds that howled like the ghosts of the town's past. The cold sank into our bones, rattled the windows, tried to creep under our skins. But we endured. We gathered near the fire, wrapped in blankets, telling stories until Ethan's eyelids drooped and Clara's head leaned heavy against her hand. Each storm passed. Each season survived. Through it all, I felt the town shift, no longer hollow, no longer abandoned. It had voices again, footsteps, work, laughter, love. The journals I once found, filled with stories of betrayal and greed, felt like they belonged to another world entirely. Their words reminded me of who I had once been: selfish, blind, chasing fortunes while love slipped through my fingers. But now, in the quiet of nights filled with Clara's soft humming and Ethan's steady breathing, I realized something simple. The town was no longer built on greed. It was built on kindness. And for the first time in decades, so as I do not think the grief is gone. It lingers, as it always will. Some nights I still wake reaching for a voice I'll never hear again. Some mornings I stare too long at Ethan and see her face in his, and the ache twists sharp enough to take my breath away. But grief is not all I carry now. Alongside it, I carry laughter, warmth, the stubborn hope of a garden blooming in poor soil. I may not have many years left. My steps are slower, my hands more unsteady, but I no longer fear the end, because when it comes, I will not leave this world as a ghost. I will leave as a man who built something again, who protected when it mattered, who loved even after he thought love had been buried forever. I've lived long enough to know that years don't announce themselves when they pass. They slip by, like thieves in the dark, stealing one season at a time. A man only notices when he wakes one morning and the child he swore was still small is suddenly running faster than his own legs will carry him. Or when the hands that once swung a hammer without strain now ache with every nail driven. That's how the years went in. New Haven, quietly, relentlessly, but not without meaning. The first year after Clara and Ethan came into my life was the hardest. Not because of enemies or hunger or storms, though those things came often enough. No, the hardest part was learning how to live again. I had come to that town to bury myself in silence, to let the wind and the dust cover me until no one remembered my name. Instead, I found myself rising with the sun, cutting wood, patching walls, and listening to a boy's laughter echo down streets that had been dead for half a century. That laughter saved me and frightened me, because I knew what it was to love a child, and I knew what it was to lose one. Ethan's cough lingered for months. Some nights the sound would claw me out of my sleep, and I'd stumble to where Clara lay awake, holding his small frame against her chest, her eyes red with worry. I'd sit by the fire, feed the flames, fetch water, do anything I could just to keep my hands from shaking. I told myself I wasn't replacing my daughter, that I wasn't building a new family where mine had been destroyed. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. I needed him to live. I needed him to survive in ways I hadn't admitted even to myself. When spring came, Clara planted the garden behind the old store. She broke the soil with her hands, calloused and cracked, and placed seeds in the dirt as though she were burying treasure. I stood at a distance at first, certain nothing would grow in that dead earth. But weeks later, green shoots rose stubbornly against the odds. Beans, potatoes, squash, small things, but alive. I remember the way Clara smiled at them, her face softening, her shoulders lifting as though some part of her had finally exhaled. That garden wasn't just food. It was proof that life could return. Summer bore down on us with heat that cracked lips and split the ground. The sun glared hard on the roofs I tried to mend, on the fences I tried to raise. My back ached, sweat soaked through my shirt, but for the first time in years, I welcomed the ache. It reminded me of the days in my father's fields when labor had meaning. Clara's garden thrived under that sun, and Ethan grew stronger too. His cough faded little by little, replaced by the sound of his feet pounding across dirt streets as he rolled an old wagon wheel with wild shouts of triumph. Autumn brought cooler winds, and with them, a harvest. I remember the weight of baskets filled with potatoes, the smell of squash roasting over fire. We sat together at night, the three of us, eating from bowls chipped by time, and for the first time since my daughter's death, I felt something close to peace. The silence no longer pressed against my chest like a coffin lid. It wrapped around you as gently like a blanket, broken by the crackle of fire and the low hum of Clara's voice as she sang to Ethan. But it was winter that tested us most. The cold came down from the hills like a predator, sharp and merciless. Winds howled through cracks in the walls, snow drifted against the doors, and firewood vanished quicker than I could split it. Nights were long, each hour stretched taut with worry. Clara huddled close to Ethan, and I kept the fire alive with hands that grew raw and bloodied from the axe. More than once, I wondered if we'd survive. More than once, I thought I'd brought them to a death colder than the one they'd been running from, but each morning, the sun rose. Each morning, Ethan's laughter returned, thin at first, then stronger. We endured. That was all survival. Really was, endurance. The second year brought changes I hadn't expected. Ethan's health improved steadily. His legs grew steady, his cheeks filled with color, and his curiosity became a force that pulled me into life whether I wanted it or not. "Why does wood crack in the fire, Grandpa?" He'd ask, and before I knew it, I was teaching him the secrets of flame. "Why does the sky turn red at sunset?" And I'd find myself explaining storms, clouds, winds, things I hadn't spoken of in decades. The first time he called me Grandpa, the word nearly knocked me to my knees. I didn't correct him. I didn't remind him that I wasn't blood. Because in that moment, I realized I wanted it to be true. Clara, too, began to change. She no longer looked at me with suspicion, waiting for the day I'd cast them out. Instead, she met my eyes when we spoke. She laughed sometimes softly, almost like she was testing the sound. And she worked harder than anyone I'd ever known. She patched clothes, tended the garden, repaired broken furniture. She brought a gentleness to the town, a warmth I hadn't believed possible. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, I'd catch her humming songs under her breath, not unlike the ones my mother used to sing when I was a boy. Those moments reminded me that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it slips in quietly, unnoticed, until you realize the wound doesn't ache as much as it used to. The town itself shifted too. Where once the streets had felt like a graveyard, they now echoed with life, the sound of hammer against wood, the rhythm of a saw, the thud of footsteps that weren't mine alone. The silence still lingered, but it was no longer suffocating. It became a canvas, and our lives were the brushstrokes painted across it. By the third year, New Haven no longer felt like a ghost town. It wasn't bustling, no crowds filled the streets, no trains whistled at the depot. But it was alive in its own way. Gardens grew in patches of earth that had once been dust. Windows that had been broken now gleamed with glass scavenged and cut to fit. Shutters banged not from neglect but from the hands of a boy playing chase. One evening, Clara stood in the square, watching Ethan roll his wheel down the street, and she said, almost to herself, "It doesn't feel like a ghost anymore, Ethan." Heard her and shouted back, "It's New Haven." He grinned wide, dirt smudged across his cheeks, his voice bold and certain. The name stuck. That night, I carved the words into a plank of wood and nailed it above the store, New Haven. For the first time in decades, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The years blurred after that. Not without hardship, no. Storms ripped, roofs from their nails. Illness returned more than once, striking Clara with fever, leaving us fearful all over again. Coyotes prowled too close, rattling chickens we had finally managed to raise. But each challenge passed. Each storm endured. And with every hardship, we grew stronger. New Haven grew stronger. Now. When I walk those streets, I don't see ruins anymore. I see Clara hanging laundry on a line, her hands steady as cloth flutters in the wind. I see Ethan chasing chickens he swore we needed, his laughter bouncing off walls that once held nothing but echoes. I see gardens sprouting where dust once rained, fences standing straight, roofs mended against the sky, and when the silence falls now, as it always does when the wind dies down and night stretches across the land, it no longer feels like a grave. It feels like peace. That is how the first years in New Haven passed slowly, stubbornly, with sweat, laughter, tears, and silence reshaped into something worth living in. But peace, as I learned long ago, is never permanent. It is a gift the world gives you for a time, before testing you again, and our test was coming. I used to believe we were the last living souls on earth. The way the silence lay over that town, the way the night stretched out without end, I thought no one would ever find us. And in truth, part of me wanted it that way, but nothing stays hidden forever. Not even the dead. The first visitor came one autumn evening. Years after we named the town New Haven, the air was crisp, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the harvest lay heavy in baskets lined up along the store wall. Clara had just finished, hanging strips of dried meat by the fire, and Ethan was running circles around the square, a wooden sword in his hand, shouting about battles only he could see. That's when I saw him. A figure appeared at the far edge of town, walking slow in the sinking light. No pack, just a worn coat and boots scuffing gravel. Instinct gripped me. Strangers meant danger. My hand went to the rifle. Clara stepped out. "Who is it?" "She whispered. "Don't know, we'll see." The man stopped at the square. His face was weathered, beard patchy, eyes alert. "Didn't think anyone still lived here." Ethan froze mid-swing. Clara pulled him close. "Some of us do," I said. He nodded. "Don't mean harm. Just passing through. Heard this place was dead." I saw the hunger in his eyes, the tremor in his hands. Desperate, not dangerous. Clara's glance asked the question, "Do we help him?" The old me would have sent him away. But I remembered the day I almost drove Clara and Ethan off. So I lowered my hand. "There's food enough for tonight." He ate Clara's stew like a starving man. His name was Jonah. By morning, he was gone, just an empty bowl and a whispered thanks. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. Word spread. Soon others came, a woman with 2 children, a family with nothing but blistered feet. Each time I struggled, protect what we had by closing the gates, or honor it by opening them. Clara's answer was always the same. If no one had taken you was in, we wouldn't be here. The hardest visitor came in the 4th year. A man in worn finery, carrying himself like someone who once had power. When I asked what brought him, he said, "I lost my boy." His hollow voice echoed my own past. I couldn't comfort him. I only sat in silence, drowning in memories. He left by morning, but his words gnawed at me. These visitors reminded me New Haven wasn't just mine anymore. It was alive, fragile but real. And if the lost could find us, so could the wolves. They came again in late summer. Engines growled. Over the hills. Ethan, now strong and tall, ran to Clara's side. My hand touched the rifle, but I held steady. Rage alone wouldn't protect us. "Inside," I told Clara. She obeyed without a word. 3 trucks this time. Dust boiled as hard-eyed men spilled out. Their leader was the same as before, aged, but sharper, colder. He looked around the square, smirk curling. "Well, well," he said. "The little bird built herself a nest." I stepped forward, rifle loose in my hand, not raised but ready. My voice was low, rough. "This is New Haven, and you're not welcome here," the leader smirked. "You again? The old man who thinks he's sheriff." His eyes swept the gardens, the laundry, the repaired homes. Busy little place. Looks like more than a hiding spot now. Looks like property. The word made my stomach turn. To him, everything was property, land, houses, people. Even Clara, even Ethan. "You had your chance before," I said. "You lost. You won't get another," he chuckled. "Lost? No. I was patient. Thought you'd starve or freeze. But you thrived, and now," he spread his arms at the square, "now you've built something worth taking." The men behind him shifted, eyes scanning the houses, hungry like vultures circling. A body not yet cold. I raised my voice so it carried. "You see a place to plunder. I see a home. And if you try to take it, you'll pay for every step." The leader tilted his head, studying me. His smirk faltered. "You don't scare me, old man." "Good," I said. "I'm not trying to." Because fear wasn't my weapon anymore. Unity was taught over the years. Not everyone who passed through stayed, but some did. A drifter who found peace. A widow with her child. A young man who only wanted land to till. Little by little, New Haven became a community. Small, fragile, but real. And when the in-laws came with their trucks and rifles, the people of New Haven stepped out of their homes. Jonah, the drifter, leaned on an axe. The widow held a shotgun older than she was. The young man gripped a shovel. Like a weapon. Clara stood in the store's doorway, Ethan at her side, their eyes on me. We weren't many. But we were enough. The leader saw it too. His smirk slipped. "So this is it? A handful of strays in my way?" "This isn't your way," I said. "Not anymore." The square held its breath. Dust swirled, sun burned low. His men shifted uneasily. They'd expected fear, submission. Instead, they saw resolve. Finally, the leader spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." He turned, barking orders. Engines roared, dust churned, and just like that, they were gone. Clara exhaled, her shoulders trembling. Ethan ran to me, rapping, his arms around my waist. "I wasn't scared," he whispered. I ruffled his hair, throat too tight to speak. He was lying, but he was braver than I'd ever been at his age. That night, around the fire, we sat together. No one spoke much, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was proud. It was ours. I realized then the town wasn't mine to protect anymore. It belonged to all of us. And together, we'd turned it from a graveyard into a haven. The shadows had come back, but this time, we hadn't faced them alone. Time steals quietly, little by little. But sometimes it gives. I saw that in Ethan. When I first met him, he was frail, coughing through nights, legs trembling. But years worked. On him like rivers on stone, slowly carving strength where there had been fragility. By 12, he no longer coughed himself awake. He ran the streets of New Haven with lungs that drank air like water. His laughter carried high, brightening even broken windows. He followed me everywhere. "Grandpa, show me how to sharpen the axe." "Grandpa, how do you tell if soil's good enough to plant?" "Grandpa, did you really fight men with your bare hands?" His questions never stopped. And in answering, I remembered what it was to live. The first time I took him hunting, his hands shook holding the rifle. When the deer stepped into the clearing, his shot cracked too high. The deer bolted, his face crumpled. I missed. I rested a hand on his shoulder. "Good. Missing means you'll learn. One day, your hands will steady." He didn't sulk. He nodded. "Then next time I'll do better." And he did. Months later, he brought down his first rabbit. He carried it back like a crown. Clara cooked it, and Ethan sat straighter, not because of the food, but because he had provided. That night, I remembered my daughter's pride when she'd once helped me carry groceries. Ethan's joy was the same. It hurt to remember, but it healed too. The years rolled on. Ethan grew taller, stronger. He split wood clean, patched roofs, planted without complaint. I taught him to fight, to hold a rifle steady, to use his fists when he had nothing else. He learned fast, precise, determined. But what struck me most wasn't his strength. It was his kindness. A stray dog once limped into town, ribs showing. Before I could chase it off, Ethan was there, kneeling, offering scraps. Clara scolded him, said the dog would bring fleas. But Ethan only smiled, whispering, "He just wants a place too." The dog never left. Neither did Ethan's kindness. He helped without being asked, patching the widow's fence, hauling water for Jonah, sitting by the fire with the younger kids, telling them stories until they laughed. He wasn't just surviving. He was becoming what the town needed most, hope. On his 15th birthday, I gave him my father's knife, the handle smooth from generations. "This isn't just for cutting wood," I told him. "It's a reminder. A man's strength isn't in steel, it's in what he protects with it." He met my eyes steady. "I'll protect this place, Grandpa. I'll protect Mom. I'll protect you." That word, Grandpa, rang through me like a bell. That night I wept. Not grief alone, but something softer. Because in that word, I heard not just what I'd lost, but what I'd found. Ethan grew restless at times, curious about the world beyond New Haven. He'd stand at the edge of town, staring down the dirt road. "What's out there, Grandpa?" "Other towns, some living, some dead. People like us. People not like us. Will I see them? Maybe, but don't hurry. The world has teeth." He'd nod, though the hunger in his eyes never dimmed. Part of me feared the day he'd leave. But more than fear, I felt pride. By 17, he was taller than me, stronger than me. His voice deepened, his hands calloused. But when he laughed, it still carried that same bright joy that first pulled me back to life. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and painted the town gold, he stood beside me, watching the shadows stretch. "Grandpa," he asked, "do you ever think about leaving? About starting somewhere else?" I breathed deep, years settling heavy on me. I thought about leaving once. Thought about burying myself in silence. But I stayed, and I'm glad I did. He nodded. "Me too." He didn't say it outright, but I heard it. New Haven wasn't just a place for him, it was home. And as I looked at him, tall, steady, I felt the ache of something both painful and sweet. My daughter was gone. Nothing would change that. But through Ethan, his laughter, his kindness, his will to grow, she lived again. He was not her, but proof that love, once buried, can bloom. The boy I once carried through fever was now a man. In his eyes I saw not just redemption, but legacy. I used to measure days by how hard silence pressed on me. Now I measure them by how quickly Ethan crosses the square when Clara calls, by how many shirts dry on the line before evening, by how often I set tools down to rub the ache out of my hands. Age comes by inches, then all at once. I feel it in my bones now. Clara tells me to sit. "Just for a moment," she says, soft enough to leave me pride. So I sit and watch New Haven breathe. In the morning it inhales, doors open, smoke rises, wheels creak, voices carry as the sun warms. At night it exhales, shutters close, chickens settle, lanterns glow like small fires in a sleeping animal's ribs. I know life when I see it. New Haven lives. Clara is much of the reason. She puts a house right in ways that feel like promises kept. Bread that never fails, stitches that hold. A look that says storms pass if you keep the fire fed. Once I mistook quiet for weakness. Then I watched her hold fever at bay with only claws and will, face men who thought they owned the sun, and keep standing. If this town has bones, they're hers. We don't speak often of what was taken from her. We don't need to. Scars speak for themselves. She knows mine. I know hers. The rest is work days and the comfort of small things, washing, mending. Baskets filled at dusk, the hum she carries from room to room. Some evenings I close my eyes and hear my mother again, the world softened by a voice that insists good work remains. Ethan keeps growing. His stride outpaces mine now. He carries lumber with care, setting it down like laying a hand on something sleeping. He's learned not just how to do, but why, because a nailed board keeps rain off, makes a room quiet enough for a child's sleep, makes a house into home. He calls me Grandpa without thought. Sometimes it rings like a bell in the old church. That has none. I answer, trying to keep my voice steady. Most days I manage. Some days I don't. Grief and joy are neighbors. They share a fence. I write in the evenings. Nothing fancy, just notes in a ledger I found. What we planted, which hinge squeals, what went wrong with a patch. And sometimes I write to my daughter, as if she's only stepped out. I tell her what Ethan asked me, how he laughed, how he wiped his boots without being told. I tell her about Clara's bread, beans climbing higher than the pole, the way wind curls through the square at dusk. The silence listens still. The difference is, now it answers, not with words, but with spoons on bowls, boots on stoops, Clara's hum, a boy's questions, an owl's cry in the cottonwood. Old men make choices before the road runs out. One is what to do with his name. Mine once hung over offices and brass plaques, tied to contracts and echoing rooms. I don't need that now. A name can be something else, a blessing, a permission. So I put it where it belongs, in the papers that say this town is ours. Not mine, ours. We called it a charter because the widow liked the sound. We signed it because our word is our word. The deed I bought for $10 became a ledger paid in a currency I never knew when I was young. Some days I walk to the ridge and sit on the rail where trains never came. You can see all of New Haven, the patchwork roofs, the crooked fence always waiting, the garden plots like green stitches, smoke from 3 chimneys. If the wind comes south, you hear tools clatter, a crack as Ethan splits a knotty log. From the north, hens scolding nobody in particular. I sit and count what I once missed. Proof life is more than breathing. Proof living is noticing. I am slower. Now ladders dizzy me, nails blur. Ethan says, "I've got it, Grandpa." And he does. There's sting in stepping aside when you once held the center. But sweetness too, if you let yourself taste it. To watch what you love carried by hands you trust, that is the best an old man can ask for. Storms still come. Not men this time, but weather. Rain that falls in sheets, wind that yanks at doors, winters that eat courage. We've lost roofs, a hen to a fox, rows of beans to hail. Worse to a baby who didn't live, a man who didn't stop coughing, words said in anger, and the long quiet to mend them. New Haven is no heaven, it's a haven. The difference is work, and the door never locks itself. I buried the rifle. That might interest you. Took it to the cottonwood, laid it in oilcloth, tamped the earth. Ethan asked, "What if we need it?" I told him, "Then we'll dig it up. But let it rest until the work calls for it." He understood. He always does. We planted a tree there, a young one that will need tying up for a couple of years before it can stand its own weather. I like the thought of roots working quietly where my old weapon sleeps. We're not erasing what we were. We're putting it where it belongs, in the ground, feeding what might outlive us. On the spring morning we raised the new sign. The first one I carved had finally surrendered to sun and wind. We held a small gathering. Nothing ceremonial, no speeches. Just standing shoulder to shoulder while Ethan set the post and Clara checked it level with her eye. Better than any tool I've owned. The board is simple, New Haven, letters cut clean, burned with a coal. Beneath it, almost hidden, we pressed the old town's name with the heel of a nail. Not out of reverence, but out of truth. We are what came after, and also what came from. After Clara put a pot of stew on, the kids ran circles until they looked rolled in flour. Jonah told his story about silence scaring him worse than wolves. And the widow laughed and hit his shoulder with a spoon. I sat and let the talk pass through me like warm water. For a moment, I forgot to brace against joy. It didn't hurt. It held. Some nights the old silence returns, the kind that pressed me flat the first time I parked in this place. But it's different now. It's laced with the residue of the day, the sharp smell of sawdust, Clara's humming settling into boards, the last laugh refusing to leave the rafters. If I listen long enough, I hear another sound beneath it, my daughter's laughter, not as a ghost, but as part of the loaf of my life. You cannot strain it out. That is how you carry your dead, not as stones in your pocket, but as flour in your bread. I've left things for Ethan, the knife, the ledger with my thumb smudge at the edge, the old pocket watch that keeps poor time. Unless you keep touching it. And that is its lesson. A box of nails sorted by size, so he won't have to hunt for what he needs. Letters he can open when he wants to know what I thought of him at 12, at 15, the day he set a post straight without me steadying it. I left him my stories, too, which is to say I left him myself. Do I think about endings? Of course. I'm an old man, but I think about them kindly now. The man I used to be thought the end was a thief that would kick down the door. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's a guest who takes his hat off and waits to be invited in. If he's polite, he gets coffee and one last story. If he's rude, well, I've buried a rifle and planted a tree. When my chest tightens once fear, now just a bell that says, "Sit, Richard." I go to the bench by the cottonwood and listen to the creek. Ethan finds me there sometimes and doesn't make a fuss. He sits and lets the quiet do the work. After a while he'll say, "Want me to finish the hinge on the back door?" And I'll grin because he knows what it means when I hand a task over. It's his for good. Clara never scolds me for staying out too long. She leaves a blanket on the rail when the air turns, and a mug beside it that cools the way good things do. A home is built out of that. Enough forethought to make you brave, enough mercy to make you soft. I don't know how many seasons I have left. That isn't sadness, just measurement. I keep my boots by the door and my hat on the peg, but I've stopped sharpening tools. I'll never swing again. A young man tries to be necessary. An old man's gift is making sure he isn't. Not because he doesn't matter, but because what he built will matter without him. That's how I know we've done it right here. The garden will need weeding the day after my last. The hens will lay or not lay. A hinge will squeal, and someone will oil it. A child will cough in the night, and 2 rooms will wake, one to hum, one to put another log on the fire. Life will continue. That is mercy. If you've listened this far, you know the truth I learned late. $10 bought me a town of bones. Kindness taught me how to live in it. But here's the fuller truth. I didn't save New Haven. New Haven saved me, Clara with her steadiness, Ethan with his questions. The visitor who showed me grief has company. The winters that forced us close. The springs that forgave us. The bell that isn't there but rings anyway when a boy calls, "Grandpa, come look." The other evening, as the sun washed the town in gold, Ethan climbed the ladder I cannot and set the last shingle I couldn't finish. He tapped it in, sat back on his heels, and nodded first to himself, then to me. No crowing, just quiet understanding. He climbed down, handed me the hammer, and said, "It'll keep tonight." It was the best compliment of my long life. We stood there until the light thinned, and I could hear Clara setting bowls on the table. I smelled bread. Somewhere a child argued for one more story before surrendering to sleep. I put my hand on Ethan's shoulder and thought of my daughter, of the first night in this dead town, of the cough that broke the silence. I thought of the grave I came to purchase and the beginning I was sold instead. I used to ask, who else could be living in a dead town? I know now. everyone who decides to dot. So here's my question for you. Because stories deserve to leave more than just their own ending. When your ghosts come knocking, not from the cemetery, but from inside your ribs, what will you do? Will you let silence bury you, as I almost did? Or will you open the door, set another place at the table, and call it by its true name? The kind of haunting that heals. I opened the door. It changed the weather of my life. If you listen close, you can hear New Haven breathing. If you listen closer, you might notice your own house trying to do the same. What will you do with that breath?